Hello and welcome. My name is Christine Nelson, and I manage the Research Fellowships Program at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Many of you who are joining us tonight know that we are a research library and cultural institution with roots going back to 1731. And tonight's talk is one of many events that we host online and in person throughout the year on topics related to the history of the United States and the Atlantic world. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you will return for more events hosted by the Library Company. As the fellowships manager, I am especially pleased to have the opportunity to introduce one of our fellowship program alums, Dr. Susan Brandt. She now teaches in the history department at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Hello, Susan. And she will be speaking to us tonight about her research on women healers of the early Philadelphia area. She even promises to help us understand how the Library Company itself served as a player in that history, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that. It was some 10 years ago that Dr. Brandt spent time at the Library Company as one of our William H. Helfand Fellows in American Medicine, Science, and Society, and we're very happy to welcome her back tonight. At about the same time, she also held a dissertation fellowship at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and she went on to earn her PhD in history from Temple University here in Philly. Her dissertation on women healers received a major honor from the Organization of American Historians. It was awarded their 2016 Lerner Scott Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in US women's history, and we congratulate you for that, Susan. She further developed that research into the book, Women Healers, Gender, Authority, and Medicine in Early Philadelphia, which was published last year by Penn Press in partnership with the McNeil Center. A few months ago, the Library Company had the distinct honor of publicly recognizing women healers with an honorable mention for our biennial First Book Award. That is an award that recognizes an extraordinary contribution to American studies by an author whose first published book relies upon significant research conducted at the Library Company. So we congratulate you for that, Susan. For this last year's award, we were considering books that were published during the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is one of the most significant health crises of our time. So our selection committee found it especially fitting to honor a book that sheds new light on the historic contributions of women frontline medical workers of our region. I drafted the call for nominations for our biennial First Book Award, and I deliberately chose not to advertise it as an award for what is often called an early career scholar, because there are many ways that people come to publish their first book. Dr. Brandt, for example, had a significant career as a nurse practitioner before embarking on her doctoral studies, and her first book reflects the accomplishments of the fullness of her medical and scholarly career. So there are many ways many people come to publish their first book. So if you have questions during the presentation, I invite you to go ahead and type them into the chat while they occur to you, or feel free to save them until the end of the program, and Dr. Brandt will be happy to address them then. So I am now very pleased to turn the program over to Susan Brandt.
Thank you, Christine. I really appreciate this opportunity. And many thanks to you and to Allison Kronstadt for your work to make this fireside chat possible. And I'm also really honored that the Library Company recognized my book during my years at Temple and the McNeil Center and during my fellowship. The Library Company is what I'd like to think of as my archival home. My book reflects many rewarding and happy hours at the Library Company and at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania next door. And I owe a real debt of gratitude to the library's generous archivists, librarians, and staff. And thank you all for zooming in to this fireside chat. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions after the talk. And I'm just going to take a minute and set up the PowerPoint, and then and I'll be right back. Okay. The title of my presentation is Follow the Science, Women Healers, the Library Company, and the Pursuit of Medical Knowledge in Early Philadelphia. And Christine, I'm seeing multiple, I'm just trying to see if, are you seeing more than one? Are you seeing my cameo or?
Everything looks fine. We see your
Okay.
presentation and we see your cameo. So I think you can
Okay,
go right ahead.
perfect. Okay, I'm seeing your cameo also, so I just want to be sure that you can see the slides. Okay, that's perfect. Good. Okay, so Follow the Science, Women Healers, the Library Company, and the Pursuit of Medical Knowledge in Early Philadelphia. And one of the goals of my book project was to recover the lives and practices and voices of women healers. And I initially thought that I would just find a few women, practicing as herbalists in their communities, but I was intrigued to discover the diversity of women's practices along with their engagement with Enlightenment science. And my title captures that currently overused phrase, follow the science. But I found that women healers were doing just that. In my book, let me just make sure I can. In my book, I argue that women healers were not inflexible traditional practitioners destined to fall victim to the onward march of Enlightenment science and capitalism. Instead, women adapted their practices as they found new sources of healing authority, including the emerging authority of science. And my book, my research also underscores the centrality of the Library Company, not only as a book repository, but also as a philosophical society, a site of medical and scientific knowledge exchange. And I'd like to start with an excerpt from my book to get you into the historical moment and so that you can hear the voice of a woman healer. The quotes are from Elizabeth Coates Pascal's mid-18th century medical recipe book housed at the College of Physicians. Pascal was a Philadelphia Quaker healer and merchant. She sold dry goods and practiced medicine in her shop on Market Street. And literate women often kept household manuscripts that might include cooking, medical, and household recipes. And manuscripts like Pascal's, though, that were predominantly medical, could signal healing expertise or a woman's medical practice in the community. And the excerpt that I'll read to you is over 100 and one of 150 entries in Pascal's book that, along with her business account book and her will, are the only records she left behind. So women's recipe books can be really important sources of information. Fortunately, her book is particularly detailed, as you can kind of get a glimpse of here. Pascal included her patients' symptoms and outcomes, as well as the webs of medical and scientific information exchanges that imbued her remedies with multiple layers of authority. As I read, watch for ways that Pascal engages with science and watch for the Library Company as the main character in the story. In her medical manuscript, Elizabeth Pascal recorded an outbreak of an illness in her neighborhood characterized by a violent swelling in the throat. As she noted, I was almost choked with the swelling and scarce able to swallow a drop of drink. She described the illness as quinsy, a pustular swelling around the tonsils, which might have been caused by diphtheria or another infection. And in severe cases, quinsy could actually lead to suffocation. Pascal's daughter was also afflicted. And amid her family health crisis, Pascal's neighbors were also ill, and they sought her healing advice. Fortunately, she knew a Native American herb that would perform the cure. As Pascal explained, I made a strong tea of rattlesnake weed and put a vial funnel bottom upwards over the top of the teapot. She instructed patients, suck the steam strongly down your throat and through the funnel, and then gargle with rattlesnake weed tea. She noted proudly, my neighbors could eat and swallow anything within a few hours. In the face of this severe illness, Pascal knew she needed to describe rattlesnake weed with botanical precision, so it would not be confused with Seneca snakeroot and rattlesnake root. According to Pascal, rattlesnake weed grows wild on poor barren land. The stalks are about 2 foot high, straight and woody, of the deep red color of birch. Its leaves are the size and shape of tea leaves, indented round the edges with small yellow flowers that bloom in September. And the plant that you see here in the picture is easily recognizable in botanical atlases as Hieracium venosum or rattlesnake weed. Pascal's entry invokes Indigenous and European women's longstanding skills in herb lore. However, her detailed observations also speak to her familiarity with the language of natural philosophers who were the scientists of the period and their project to reframe the vernacular knowledge of medicinal plants within the new science of botany. And Pascal's margin notes makes this connection clear. She cited her cousin, John Bartram, a self-taught but internationally recognized botanist who participated in transatlantic scientific networks that included Carl Linnaeus, the founder of botanical taxonomies. She added, John Bartram says rattlesnake weed is good applied as a poultice to dispel swelling on the limbs or body. And some of you may have had the opportunity to visit the Bartram House and Garden south of Philadelphia. So Bartram connected Pascal to extensive healing and scientific networks that bolstered her medical credibility. In her recipe book, Pascal increasingly incorporated sources that demonstrate her recognition of the new authority of experimental science. She compiled information from medical and scientific texts that she checked out from the Library Company of Philadelphia. While reading a history of the Materia Medica by the English botanist John Hill, she transcribed Latin terms like Didynamia gymnospermia, a class of plants that includes lavender. And Latin was the language of science that could be used to exclude women. But Pascal, this didn't bother Pascal at all. And she often wrote, look, in a particular book like Hill's Materia Medica, apparently assuming that her readers could also check them out from the library company. And recipes like letters were semi-public documents. Her readers might be family members, neighbors, friends, or perhaps fellow healers who might copy recipes out of her book. And because the library company has been in continuous operation, 21st century scholars can also follow in Pascal's reading footsteps. Through her self-directed studies, documented observations, and medical experiments, Pascal embraced the authority of science. And as she shared these recipes that she described, some of them as my own invention, as you see here, she became an influential link in wide-ranging networks of natural philosophies. And she positioned herself alongside learned male experts as a legitimate producer of medical knowledge. And, I think that her entry here, an excellent salve for a burn, my own invention, her sense of pride and confidence in her practice just seems to leap off the page. And the new science, what they called the new science in the 18th century, challenged the longstanding preeminence of university degrees and ancient experts, and instead emphasized hands-on empirical knowledge that was accessible to women. Pascal details her medical networks that included Euro-American, Native American, and African American women and men. Nonetheless, I kind of jumped the gun here, but you see them here. Most 18th century Enlightenment natural philosophers, and here are a few, maintained that reason and logic were white male attributes, and they argue that white women and people of color were innately illogical and passionately emotional and unfit for the rational enterprises of medicine and science. And until recently, this discourse has been mirrored by the marginalization of women in histories of medicine and science. According to the scholar Patricia Farah, women haven't been written out of the history of science, they've never been written in. However, if we flip the traditional narrative and examine the history of science from the bottom up, the lines between science and folk healing are blurrier, and the story includes numerous women and men of various ethnicities and social orders. And European governments and universities sent natural philosophers to the Americas to discover commercially valuable medicinal plants and minerals. And, we still do this today. We call it bioprospecting. So these, there was bioprospecting going on at that time also. And these gentlemen of science recognized Native Americans, peoples of African descent, and ordinary settlers as critical sources of information about the natural world. And I argue that women were on the front lines of grassroots medical and scientific knowledge production. And this persistent lack of historical voices for women practitioners is one of the reasons that I became interested in the topic during my doctoral studies. when I embarked on a second career in history after my first as a nurse practitioner. And as I read Pascal's manuscript, my mind strayed back to the 1980s when I worked in a clinic in a medically underserved area in the mountains of North Carolina. And I remembered meeting lay healers and granny midwives who described their medical recipe books full of remedies that had been collected, curated, and passed down from mother to daughter through generations. And although I was ostensibly the healthcare expert, of course, I was like in my 20s and still inexperienced, these practitioners offered me medical advice as well as herbs like ginseng and yellowroot that are also in Pascal's book. I also live near the lands of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. And when I visited their new museum in the 1980s, I was intrigued by Cherokee's efforts to preserve their unique cultures, including a holistic culture of healing that encompassed both personal and community wellness. So my experiences, in my own life piqued my interest in writing my dissertation and book on women healers. And I'd like to give you an overview of the book so you can place the information from chapter 4, The Authority of Science, in context, and perhaps to meet a few more women healers, just so you don't think that Elizabeth Pascal is the only one. In 8 chapters beginning in the late 17th and continuing on into the early 19th century, I explore women's medical work and the ways that they appropriated various types of medical authority to counter attempts to marginalize their practice. Chapter 1 is called Healing Legacies. As they settled in the greater Philadelphia area, Anglo-American women built on the cultural authority of their foremothers' healing work in England. And most women of various classes and ethnicities practice healing within their home, and others also delivered medical care to their communities, both in England, Europe, and later in the colonies. Gulielma Springett Penn, the wife of Pennsylvania's founder, William Penn, was cited in a biography as being skilled in physic or medicine and surgery. She also kept a medical recipe manuscript that maps her expert knowledge of what we would recognize as medicine, surgery, ophthalmology, pharmacy, and nursing. The manuscript, which is held at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, has even deeper roots. It was passed down from her grandmother, Catherine Partridge Springett, who, according to one account, saw 20 patients in a morning and cared for long-term invalids at no charge. And as you can see here, Catherine Partridge was an eye specialist who recorded over 30 eye remedies in the section of the book. And she was also so proficient in cataract surgery that, according to one source, Stevens, the great oculist, sent many to her house when there was difficulty of a cure. And actually, it was not unusual for women to become ocular experts who couched cataracts using a needle to displace the cloudy lens. Actually, it required the same fine motor skills that women developed with decorative needlework. So, we can feel pretty thankful for LASIK surgery. I'm not sure I would want to go through that. So the recipe book demonstrates that Springett and Penn engaged with ideas of early modern science, documenting their experiments in botany and chemistry that informed their medical practices. They copied remedies out of books and edited them according to their own experiments. And you can see here that she copied a recipe for a popular chemical medicine, elixir proprietatis, and also, edited it a bit. Penn and Springett and other women healers shared the same medical worldview as educated physicians and surgeons, deploying both standard humoral medical theories as well as newer chemically based medicine. Both involved balancing certain essences in the body. And women employed invasive procedures like bloodletting or prescribing emetics to induce vomiting, along with milder herbal cures. And again, these were in humoral medicine. These were geared towards ridding the body of bad humors. And I don't have time to go into these theories, but I think what I want what the take home is that it's important to remember that ideas of medicine, science, and the body are in early America are very different from those that we see today, certainly different from standard Western medicine. In addition, Indigenous and Black women had their own medical worldviews, and all of these came together in early America to form hybrid healing cultures. So, in summary, as Penn's colleague, Lady Damaris Mashin said, I see no reason why it should not be thought that all science lies as open to a lady as to a man. Along with her husband, Gulielma Penn was instrumental in establishing a radical sect called the Society of Friends or Quakers. In his writings on education, William Penn emphasized the importance of teaching girls as well as boys what he called useful knowledge, which included botany and healing skills. Quaker women conveyed to Pennsylvania their useful medical skills as well as radical ideas about equality, female education, and public activism. And here you see women preaching in Quaker meetings, which women speaking in public or preaching was far outside the gender conventions of the period. Elizabeth's mother, Beulah Jake Coates, was one of these first settlers who passed down these radical norms and healing skills to her daughter, Elizabeth. In Chapter 2, Healing Networks, I examined how Pascal became an influential node within complex webs of medical information exchanges that cross lines of gender, class, and race. She wrote, a countryman advised my servant, Martha Owen, to use juniper oil, which cured her laryngitis after she had applied to several doctors but found no relief. And the phrase cured when the doctor fails runs like a refrain in Pascal's book. And Pascal did collaborate with physicians, but she was also confident in her own independent practice. She recorded an elderly Black healer's successful cure for a putrefied joint that prevented an amputation. Black women retained African healing knowledge and practices despite the brutal forced migrations of the Atlantic slave trade. The freed woman healer Anna Bellamy, who specialized in bone setting, dentistry, and wound care in mid-18th century Philadelphia, was described as a woman of education and the Black doctor. Women of color were also frontline healthcare workers in Philadelphia's early days. And again, with COVID, we really do think of frontline healthcare workers. And, again, women of color were also definitely there. And in fact, I found that women practitioners of various classes and ethnicities worked as doctors, apothecaries, bone setters, cancer specialists, midwives, eye specialists, herbalists, nurses, and therapeutic bleeders, to name a few. And this freewheeling medical marketplace with few licensure or legal constrictions was a very different environment from ours now in the 21st century, where we place healthcare workers in rigid categories: physician, nurse, nurse practitioner, PA, and so on. And over the course of the project, I actually expanded my definition of women healers to construe healing in its broadest sense to encompass a spectrum of paid and unpaid healing services: diagnostic, prescriptive, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, obstetrical, and nursing care. And women's healing practices could incorporate any combination of these categories, often changing over the course of a lifetime. In Chapter 3, I argue that Indigenous women practitioners garnered healing authority based on their knowledge of local botanicals and their reputations for successful cures that were valued in their communities and among Pennsylvania's settlers. And according to several accounts, the Lenape healer, Hannah Freeman, was a doctoress and a basket maker. And Lenapes are also sometimes called Delawares. A Chester County resident remembered, I visited Hannah's wigwam and paid 5 shillings for a remedy for my sick children, comprised of herbs and pounded roots with directions for their use. Again, Native American practitioners were also frontline healthcare workers. Women healers had to overcome not only the challenges of Enlightenment science, but also the emergence of a male culture of market capitalism. Chapters 5 and 6 describe women's medical and pharmaceutical entrepreneurship. And this was another real surprise for me to find women engaging with medical consumerism. While some women worked as apothecaries in family businesses, others, like Hannah Freeman, prepared and sold medicines in their homes or shops or peddled them door to door. And I argue that their economic successes speak to women's ongoing medical authority. And medical entrepreneurship also helped women to navigate the economic downturns of the American Revolutionary period. The apothecary Elizabeth Weed exemplifies women who took over family pharmaceutical businesses after the death of male kin. In 1777, Elizabeth Weed advertised in the Pennsylvania Evening Post that despite her husband's passing, she would carry on his pharmaceutical practice as she has his receipts and been employed these several years past in preparing them herself. And her subtext was, I've been in the back room all along preparing medicines. You can still count on me. Mary Waters was an Army nurse during the American Revolution. After the war, and despite prejudices against Irish women and nurses, Waters deployed her medical acumen and wartime contacts with Philadelphia doctors, including Dr. Benjamin Rush, to develop a successful practice as a nurse, doctoress, and apothecary. She strategically published her medicines on the cover of the weekly magazine in 1798, touting the safety and efficacy of her signature worm cakes, along with Huxham's tincture of bark and other preparations. And Connie King from the library helped me unearth this advertising wrapper in the library company's stacks, showing that Waters compounded and sold medicines. And this was really a significant find in my project. As Waters and Weed created new pharmaceuticals, they shaped customers' expectations that health was a commodity that money could buy. The growth of a self-interested capitalist marketplace was accompanied by a popular culture of humanitarian sensibility that lauded those who exhibited deeply felt self-sacrificing benevolence. Some women deployed sensibility to deflect stereotypes of paid caregivers as drunks and prostitutes. And the satirical print encapsulates the image of nurses, of hired nurses at that time. Again, you see the woman, the nurse is, she's obviously drunk, she's fallen asleep. She's not only neglecting the patient, she's about to burn down the house. So again, there were very negative ideas of what a nurse was. In chapter 7, I examined how Black nurses, despite these negative images and racialized recriminations, risked their lives to provide vital nursing care for white Philadelphians during the devastating 1793 yellow fever epidemic, deploying the authority of humanitarian healing to argue for their equality and for their ability, their worthiness to be full citizens in the new republic. In chapter 8, I analyzed how a powerful culture of domesticity sought to relegate women to the private household sphere. Nonetheless, Euro-American and African-American continued to pursue medical entrepreneurship. They learned science in women's academies, and there were actually women's science academies that were sprouting up in the early 19th century. And also they embraced non-traditional medical movements, Thomsonianism, water cure, homeopathy, eclectic medicine, that were more open to training and validating women practitioners. And many women also became public health educators and leaders in health reform organizations. And Sarah Mapps Douglas is an excellent example. She was a teacher, school principal, health educator, and founding member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. She also attended classes at the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, the first women's medical school in the world, founded by Quakers in 1850. In a later commencement address, Dr. Ann Preston, a member of the first graduating class, told students that they were embarking on a new and untried course. However, as we've seen, it was instead merely one signpost on a well-trodden path populated with medically skilled women. So that kind of gives you a sense of the trajectory of my book. So let's segue back to the beginning and continue to think about this emerging authority of Enlightenment science. And Philadelphia itself plays a role here. By the mid-18th century, Philadelphia was the premier colonial city in science and medicine and was home to the colony's first hospital, medical school, lending library, and philosophical society. Pascal's friend, Benjamin Franklin, was the city's quintessential gentleman of science. Of course, we know that Ben Franklin had to come into the story. In the American Philosophical's founding statement in 1743, Franklin and Pascal's cousin, John Bartram, articulated an enlightened vision for promoting useful knowledge for the benefit of mankind. And men in the Coates and Pascal families were early members of the American Philosophical Society. Pascal and Coates men also served on the board of the Pennsylvania Hospital, a charitable institution for the sick poor founded by Franklin and Dr. Thomas Bond in 1751. Elizabeth Pascal and her mother supported the hospital's pharmacy with their funds. So women like Pascal participated informally but significantly in the city's medical and science-related organizations. Libraries became sites for the dissemination of useful medical and scientific knowledge for women as well as for men. Pascal compiled authoritative information from medical texts like those you see here that she checked out from the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731 by Ben Franklin. And although the Library Company initially denied women membership, Pascal and others circumvented this barrier by borrowing books under the auspices of male family members. And her brothers-in-law, John and Stephen Pascal, were early Library Company members. So women's de facto participation opened the way for their later official membership in the 1770s. And the library's extensive collection gave literate women access to medical and scientific information. And when Franklin and Bartram Society for Promoting Useful Knowledge was disbanded in 1746 through 1767, the Library Company took its place as a natural philosophical society. And as early as this, and it was actually housed in the State House. And again, you may see that little dome may look familiar to you. And as early as the 1730s, the Library Company had received donations of scientific instruments, including a vacuum pump, electrical apparatus, a telescope, and a microscope from the Penn family. And over time, fossil shells, botanical specimens, and other what they called curiosities of nature found their places on the library shelves. And if you've been to the Library Company, that air pump case on the left may look familiar. And these collections embodied naturalists' drive to gather, organize, and classify nature's objects in an attempt to master and control the natural world. And literate colonial women participated in this enterprise by collecting specimens, creating botanical drawings and notebooks, and recording new information about the natural world in their letters and manuscripts. Moreover, there was an emerging popular science movement that made natural philosophy and science accessible to ordinary women and men. And the Library Company sponsored lectures and demonstrations that included women. Ben Franklin awed audiences with his electrical machines while describing the medical applications of electricity in neurological diseases. Others demonstrated pneumatics, placing birds in beakers that were evacuated by a vacuum pump. And this painting appropriately shows the scientist as an impresario or a showman. And again, this is in the days before they were professional scientists. So these really were these gentlemen of science, and sometimes would go around doing these itinerant demonstrations. And popular science dovetailed with a popular health movement and a self-help print culture that promoted a profusion of pamphlets authorizing every patient to be their own doctor or doctoress, which challenged physicians' authority. And again, the Library Company held a number of these popular health books and pamphlets, along with more formal medical tomes. Along with studies in chemistry, in electricity and pneumatics, natural philosophers and women healers were interested in botany, chemistry, and anatomy. And compared to the disciplines of chemistry and anatomy, botany was considered an acceptable feminine pursuit. Women healers' long-standing expertise in herbalism was difficult to displace. Bartram and Franklin connected Pascal to local, intercolonial, and international scientific networks that included over 50 prominent male naturalists and a few women. However, Pascal's oral circuits of botanical sharing encompassed even more women. Despite her relative invisibility in the historical record, John Bartram's second wife, Anne Mendenhall Bartram, also participated in these networks and worked in the family's botanical garden and the plant export business that the family ran. She also had access to the family's medical books, as well as those of the library company, because John was an early member. Evidence suggests, whoops, excuse me, sorry. Ah, all right, we're back to Anne Bartram. Evidence suggests that Anne Bartram practiced healing outside her family circle. Pascal gave Anne's expertise equal weight with that of the Bartram men. After citing a recipe for the dropsy, Pascal noted, Cousin Anne Bartram says this cured the tavern keeper Thomas Worth when his legs were very much swelled. And dropsy was a life-threatening ailment characterized by swelling of the lower extremities, which we now understand can be caused by heart or kidney failure. So Anne was treating serious medical diseases, just as Pascal was. Unfortunately, none of Anne Bartram's correspondence is extant. However, a letter survives that was written to Anne in 1761 from the botanical expert Martha Daniel Logan of Charleston, South Carolina, who sent plants and seeds to the Bartrams. Logan wrote, I'm sending along a tub of roots of the Indian pink and some slips of Mrs. B's little flower. Logan listed almost 30 plants that she sent to the Bartrams, including pink root and a purple flower from a botanist aptly named Susanna B. And Bartram would have known that Indian pink root was an effective indigenous treatment for colonists' pervasive and debilitating infestations with intestinal worms. So it's a beautiful plant, but it's also was a medicinal plant as well. Pink root's medical uses spread to others in the Bartram's network, such as Dr. Cadwallader Colden in New York. Jane Colden, Dr. Colden's daughter, also corresponded with the Bartrams. In 1755, her father wrote to the London botanist Peter Collinson that he encouraged his daughter to pursue botanical studies, as it is not unusual for women to take pleasure in botany as a science. Collinson described Jane Colden as an accomplished lady who's scientifically skilled in the Linnaean classification system. Jane Colden was recognized for her botanic manuscript, and you see a page of one of her sketches there in the on the right bottom side, as well as her discoveries of medically useful plants. And although historical memory has privileged John Bartram and his male correspondence, Elizabeth Pascal, Anne Bartram, Martha Logan, Susanna B., and unnamed Indigenous women healers were important links in chains of botanical and medical information sharing. Women healers and gentlemen of science like Franklin and Bartram sought remedies and botanical information from Lenapes, the original residents of the Delaware Valley. Pascal noted that James Logan shared an indigenous recipe to treat a felon, which is not a criminal, but it's actually an older term for an infected finger that used the root of cattails. And in the early days before antibiotics, even infected finger could become quite serious. If it spread, one might lose a finger or a hand. And James Logan was a prominent politician and naturalist and botanical expert who mentored both Franklin and Bartram. He was also, just on an aside, a bibliophile who collected over 3,000 books that included medical and scientific tomes now held at the Library Company. Another Library Company fun fact. Logan acquired another Indian cure for a felon using roots of the violet roots from the Moravian missionary John Heckwelder. In his writings, Heckwelder praised Native American women's healing skills, and ministers and missionaries practiced medicine, and they were also these natural philosophers, scientists. Heckwelder wrote, there are Native physicians of both sexes who take considerable pains to acquire a correct knowledge of the properties and medical virtues of plants, roots, and barks for the benefit of their fellow men. He noted approvingly, their science is entirely founded on observation, experience, and the well-tried effectiveness of remedies. He found, their practices very similar to European empirical science. He also noted Lenape women healers' expertise with gynecological problems. Heckwelder wrote, the wives of missionaries in every instance in which they applied to the female Indian physicians experienced good results. But unfortunately, over time, as these botanicals became standard European pharmaceuticals, physicians erased their indigenous origins. The emerging prestige of Enlightenment science could be used to denigrate the healing expertise of both Native American and Euro-American women. But nonetheless, some literate women learned to wield the power of Enlightenment science. In addition to botanical information, Haskell sought out medical knowledge from specialists in chemistry, which was considered a male pursuit. Even though Pascal and many women healers were adept at creating medicines through distillation, which is essentially hands-on chemistry, using an apparatus called an alembic that you see there in the upper left. Pascal also copied chemical preparations from the philosophical works of the Honorable Robert Boyle and Boerhaave's new method of chemistry that she checked out from the library company. And she often annotated these famed chemist remedies based on her own medical experiments. Pascal was also interested in seawater's potential as a chemical remedy for stomach complaints. Pascal noted, they keep a barrel of fresh seawater at the Pennsylvania hospital to cure bilious colic, which caused, this is something that caused paroxysmal abdominal pain. She explained, drafts of seawater cured my friend John Arment of a severe case of colic. And Pascal's friend Mary Pemberton also successfully treated another friend's abdominal complaints with seawater. She says she consulted a treatise, likely Richard Russell's dissertation on the use of seawater, also held at the library company. Pemberton was one of the library company's first official women members. And so even though they weren't supposed to, women experimented with chemistry. And another discipline that was off limits for women was anatomy, which was becoming the most important marker of a learned physician. However, the library company provided books for Pascal's self-education. She advised readers to look in James's Great Folio Dictionary, and she provided the volume and page number for easy reference. Robert James was an Oxford-educated London physician whose medical dictionary is an imposing 3-volume set, and each volume is almost 1,200 pages. Pascal tells us that she checked the dictionary out of the library. And I remember Connie King rolling these volumes out on the library cart. And as I picked one up, I imagine Pascal hefting one of these 15-pound volumes onto the reading room table, or maybe checking it out and, kind of toting it down Market Street with this big book in her hand. And, people saying, hey, Liz, what have you got? Yeah, I've got Dr. James, or maybe putting it on the countertop in her shop and discussing this new information with other healers or patrons. After reading a section in the dictionary, Pascal transcribed a remedy for a bronchocele tumor while describing a public anatomical dissection at London's Royal Society. And this was like the premier philosophical society. To discover the passage about the tumor, Pascal plowed through 15 densely written folio pages describing an anatomical dissection presented by, quote, the preeminent and ingenious Dr. James Douglas. And Douglas was indeed a very prominent anatomist. According to Douglas, I had lately the opportunity of opening a woman about 50 years old who had a very large tumor in the forepart of the neck. The fleshy fibers of the latissimus colli were scarcely visible. The mastoideus and the corica hyoideus were extremely thin. It was connected to the levator scapula. And he goes on and on. And so through the medium of print, Pascal entered the halls of science and virtually sat in on Douglas's public dissection. If she had questions about terminology, she could refer to the anatomical diagrams in the dictionary. As she poured through esoteric anatomical language, Pascal documented more earthly similes that matched her own tactile diagnostic experiences. She found resonance with Douglas's description of the tumor as having the consistence of a cow's udder when boiled. Significantly, Pascal also copied a section that lauded not university-educated physicians, but rather an English woman healer who cured patients' tumors without risky surgery. And in those days, surgery actually was indeed, without antibiotics or anesthesia, it was indeed quite risky. Douglas explained, I was formerly acquainted with a woman who is in great reputation for resolving these tumors. Her secret consisted in anointing the part frequently with the oil of chamomile made by infusion. And as she copied this passage, Pascal extended her medical networks to include the contributions of a woman healer like herself, who might be otherwise effaced in scholarly writings. Pascal foregrounded, she constructed a more inclusive narrative of women in medicine and science and wrote herself into the story. And it's easy to dismiss women's participation in medicine and science in the 18th century because they were barred from universities and scientific organizations, and they rarely received formal recognition. Fortunately, Elizabeth Pascal's recipe books helps us to view the history of science from the grassroots rather than the top-down perspective. Pascal's and her colleagues recognized the emerging authority of empirical science, and they deployed its new rhetoric and methods of observation, experimentation, and documentation to authorize their healing practices. And the narratives of women healers of the past speak to issues that reverberate into the 21st century. The ongoing gender gap in the sciences, particularly for women of color, reflects the long history of women's marginalization in the disciplines that form the basis of healthcare-related jobs. So by telling stories that enliven the struggles and successes of women healers of the past, I hope my book provides readers with role models and strategies to navigate contemporary cultural barriers. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that wonderful overview of your important recovery work that you have been working on for so many years. I want to invite our guests to enter any questions that they have either into the chat or the Q&A function, and I will pose them to you in a moment, Susan. But I will get started. I was really grateful to see all the references to library company collection items that you consulted while you were on site at your archival home, as you like to call us. We appreciate that. And I have a very specific question, which is, where did you find Elizabeth Pascal telling people to look? Was she physically writing in our books?
She physically, yeah, well, she, in her recipe manuscript, she says,
Okay.
look, I mean, she literally says those words, look in Dr. James's great dictionary. So, and she actually is transcribing these lengthy passages. My dissertation advisor, Susan Klepp at Temple, who I know is also well known to the library company, an amazing scholar, showed me Elizabeth Pascal's book, and it is just, it's compared to even to other women's manuscripts, it's incredibly detailed. But yeah, she's checking books out, she's transcribing, and then annotating. You know, she's synthesizing that information to create her own remedies and practices.
That's fantastic. I'm going to get to a question in the Q&A in a moment, but just one follow-up question. Obviously, that Pascal recipe book is just an incredible source, and you're hearing directly from Elizabeth Pascal. Can you talk to us about some of your strategies for getting at the practices of people like Hannah Freeman, who, you know, perhaps conveyed their medical knowledge orally and to whom you didn't have direct access? It's always a struggle, but absolutely essential to try to recover those voices as well. So some example maybe of how you tackled that.
Yeah, it is really daunting. And of course, you saw how sometimes you can kind of carefully sort of read against the grain of you know, Europeans writing about Native peoples or peoples of African descent. And of course, you have to carefully look at that, but sometimes they do leave clues behind. Archaeology is, of course, important. I just kind of threw in a picture of a cosmogram that's sort of an African source of like healing authority that people would, archaeologists find in bowls in Virginia and in Pennsylvania. So we know that there were, you know, the persistence of African practices. I have to say that when I was so inspired by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's book, A Midwife's Tale, and other books that, you know, there's several other authors who've just done great work on New England healers or healers in the Caribbean. But as I started researching, I thought, well, why aren't more people doing this research? And I realized it's because it is very difficult. Some of it is you almost start with Pascal and then build around her. And some of it, I really have to say were archivists who clued me into sources that I was then able to follow up on. Um, Hannah Freeman, just going to the Chester County Historical Society and working with them to kind of keep digging information out from newspaper accounts, and from the poorhouse account has her account. So it is a real challenge, but as you say, a real important work. And some of it, it's almost like it's are very archaeological. There are days where you dig and find nothing, and then you're sort of piecing together, um, artifacts to form a mosaic.
Thank you for that. And also thank you for acknowledging that librarians and archivists are, really essential partners to researchers, and enjoyed hearing your evocation of Connie King rolling out those volumes and how that evoked for you Elizabeth Pascal, maybe walking down the streets of Philadelphia with those same heavy tones. So a related question from one of our guests, did American women healers collaborate with Native American healers?
Yeah, again, this is actually very hard to get at, but yes, indeed they did. There was, there were kind of accounts of the early Swedish settlers. Sometimes we forget our early Swedish settlers, that there are accounts, again, it's often by this naturalist Peter Kalm, that tells us that the early Swedish women were collecting remedies from Native American women. Early women in New Jersey were collecting information from Lenapes. So sometimes it's direct, and then sometimes, as in Pascal's, it can be indirect. In one instance, a Lenape man actually came to Pascal's shop for a treatment of tuberculosis, and she actually ironically treated him with a Lenape remedy. So sometimes sometimes it was passed along through different circuits, but sometimes, directly they were very interested in obtaining recipes from these skilled indigenous healers.
Thanks for expanding on that a bit. We have another question from a guest who wants you to expand a little bit more on something you mentioned in your talk. I remember you mentioned that Black women nurses were essential practitioners during the 1793 epidemic. So our guest wants to know more generally how significant a role women healers played in combating that epidemic in Philadelphia.
This was under the auspices of Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who later went on to be the ministers at St. Thomas Church here in the Black Episcopal Church here in Philadelphia. Richard Allen was later the founder of the AME Church. Richard Allen, who later married after the epidemic, married Sarah Bass Allen, and they both were founders of the AME Church, an international activist, wonderful church. When the yellow fever hit, a lot of elite Philadelphians fled, including George Washington. The capital was moved out of Philadelphia, and the Mayor Clarkson, stayed. And it was really some of the people that really stayed and did the work, who did the nursing work. They were death cart drivers. Were Black Americans were doing that work. So they were. They were actually kind of holding down the fort. Even when Benjamin Rush got sick, he had a Black assistant named Marcus who was kind of making his rounds. So I think it was a moment where, where Black Philadelphians, again, they had, these Black church members had a real sense of mission in what they were doing, but they also recognized that they were proving their worthiness, their equality, their humanitarianism, and worthiness for full citizenship. So yeah, they were critical. They were the essential frontline workers during the epidemic. Absolutely.
Thanks for that. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour, but I want to ask you one final question. I'm sure many audience members, when you give a talk, are interested in how your experience as a nurse practitioner has informed your work. And I have a question along those lines. Did you find yourself trying to assess the efficacy of some of these remedies that women employed based on your own 20th and 21st century medical knowledge?
That's a great question, and I do teach the history of health and medicine at University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And it is the challenge for historians of medicine is to actually enter into that historical moment, to actually understand that, people would say, Elizabeth Pascal bled me, and I just felt so good afterwards. And we're sort of thinking, uh, women or Benjamin Franklin are bleeding patients with yellow fever, and you're thinking, they're killing people. There's certainly, so there are moments where I think their practices are very different, but there also are moments, certainly with Native American pharmaceuticals. We know that willow bark is, Tylenol, is acetaminophen. A lot of the herbs that Native peoples were using for wounds, they were expert at wounds, are actually bacteriostatic. They were washing wounds. So some of them we do still use today. Our standard people who practice herbalism are using these same roots, St. John's wort or things like that we know are efficacious. So there's sort of two ways of thinking about it. Yes, I'm in there thinking, what is this? And then there's also that sense of trying to understand their medical worldview as well.
Thank you. What about those worm cakes?
The worm cakes, actually a lot of them were made with absinthe that actually or some, there was also a medicine called tar water that probably did kill worms, intestinal worms as well. Might sort of try to kill the patient as well. But yeah, there certainly were a number of worm treatments that would have probably been effective.
Well, I'm ready for dinner now. I would like to thank you so much, Susan Brandt, for joining us tonight and talking to us about your book, Women Healers. I believe we have a discount code in the chat. It may be way up at the top of the chat, though. Here it is. If you go to the Penn Press website and you'd like to purchase Susan's book, you can enter the discount code BRANT30, one word, and read the rest of the chapters of the book. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Please come back. We have many events coming up at the Library Company. You can read all about them on our website. And congratulations, Susan, on your honorable mention for the Biennial First Book Award. And thank you again so much for joining us tonight and sharing your research.
Thank you all, and have a good night.